Hey, hello everyone. So today we're going to be talking about Module 7, which looks at this really fascinating topic of externalities. The topic goes by a couple of other names, which I want to highlight here. And once I've given you the synonyms for this economic jargon, I want to go through and just systematically highlight for you today the four types of externalities that we are going to discuss in this course, and really just more broadly, the four types of externalities that we've classified within the field of economics. So, other terms that that we can use in lieu of this term of externalities is third party effects. You'll sometimes hear or see externalities referred to in this way. The rationale behind that language is that you have two parties to a contract. To just keep it simple, you have two parties to a contract, and their exchange, either in the provision of the good or in the consumption of the good, leads to an impact on a third entity, which was not part of the initial contract between the two. Along that same vein, you also have the term spillover effect. It can either be called a positive spillover or a negative spillover effect. And again, the idea here is that you have two entities, or really more broadly with the term spillover, you could have a whole multitude of entities part of a contract agreeing to the provision or consumption of a good or service. And in that exchange between, again, potentially a multitude of parties with this type of terminology, the consequences of that exchange then spill over to other entities, to other multitudes of entities, which again were not part of the contract. And that really is the key aspect to understanding externalities, is we are talking about economic impacts on people who didn't ask for this. They didn't sign up for whatever it is or whatever example that we are discussing. They didn't voluntarily consent, in full sum total to the provision of this good or the consumption of this good. The four types of externalities you have, and again, I'm going to go through these in more detail, but let me just list them off here. You have a positive externality in production, a positive externality in consumption, a negative externality in production, or a negative externality in consumption. When we are talking about a positive externality in production, we are referring to a good or service where the manufacturing, the provision, the supply of that product creates an additional benefit to society that is not captured by price. And so when you are looking at this graphically or in a simple supply demand model, you will notice that a positive externality has two supply curves. One is going to be labeled the marginal social cost, and one is going to be labeled the marginal private cost, which the marginal private cost is just fancy wording for the firm's own experienced supply curve. In a positive externality in production, the marginal social cost is less than, so on the model, it's going to be beneath the marginal private cost. In other words, in a positive externality in production, what we can visualize through a simple supply demand model is that the manufacturer of this product overpays. They are the ones who bear a disproportionate amount of the cost to provide that product, when doing so helps reduce the costs helps reduce the costs of others. A great example of this would be the provision of beehives, where if I have a beehive on my property to help grow a garden, I am the one paying for the cost and the maintenance of the beehive. I do receive the benefit of the beehive to my own garden, but so does my neighbor. In point of fact, so does everyone within a 5-mile radius. So I am the one, as the manufacturer of the beehive, that pays the full cost up front. But in doing so, I help my neighbors lower the cost of maintaining their garden, per se, or of the need for them to buy fertilizer to help the plants grow, because I'm the one providing the bees to facilitate the pollination. The way that a positive externality can be addressed and potentially corrected, by and large, is through subsidies, where we collect taxes. We use our local or state, or if necessary, our federal institutions of government to levy taxes. How we levy those taxes is a topic for another day, but we use our collective power through the institution of government to levy taxes, so that we can, in a more equitable way, distribute these costs of providing a beehive for the purpose of facilitating, private gardens, to continue with this example. And what we're trying to do is make sure that these high costs are lowered for the provider, and that they are distributed in a more equitable way throughout society, so that, roughly speaking, in terms of this example, costs more or less equate to benefits. Another way that we can solve this is simply through public provision. A great example of that would be the Army Corps of Engineers, which does a fantastic job abiding by what are called EWN principles. And the Army Corps of Engineers uses these EWN principles to help rebuild wetlands, for example. But more broadly, they use these principles to construct diverse ecosystems. And in doing so, the cost is borne, exclusively by the Army Corps of Engineers, but that's okay, because that's a taxpayer-funded entity, and so the benefits to society for this public provision of diverse ecosystems can more or less equitably match the costs and the benefits but that society experiences. So that's the first one. The second one is a positive externality in consumption. Here, emphasis on the word consumption. Here, we are referring to the purchase of a product. The act of acquiring the product by a consumer creates a benefit to society. Graphically, within the supply-demand model, we would show here that the marginal social benefit outweighs the private, the marginal private benefit. And in this situation, the marginal social benefit you're going to have two demand curves here. The demand curve that reflects all of society is going to be higher than the demand curve for the individual. And so in that way, it becomes intuitively obvious that the consumer, in terms of positive externalities in consumption, overpays for the product. The consumer is having to bear a disproportionate cost because, or rather, let's put it this way: the society would like there to be much more of this product provided than what is currently being provided. A great example of this would be public education, particularly K through 12 schools. You could even make an argument for education more broadly, where the benefit to society, the demand that society may have for an education, is always going to outweigh the marginal private benefit to the individual. So the question then becomes, how do we expand private demand? How do we expand that marginal private benefit to match the marginal social benefit, and so that the two demand curves now equate to each other? The solution to this has always been either through public provision, as we do in K through 12 schools here in the United States. We also see what are called Pigouvian subsidies, where we are going to offer, for example, to harken back to an earlier module of price discrimination, we are going to offer in-state tuition, or we are going to offer some sort of sliding scale when it comes to tuition for in-state residents as well. And the idea here is that we are able to expand the individual demand curve, the marginal private benefit curve, to the right, so that it more accurately measures the marginal social benefit, which is kind of where society would want this good to be consumed. So again, interesting point, this issue of positive externalities in consumption is just another element, an additional argument, as you will, to argue and advocate for additional funding by the state for its in-state residents, on top of the issue of equity that we discussed in earlier modules when we talked about price discrimination. The third type of externality is a negative externality in production. These are ones that people almost always think of when they're talking about spillover effects. People almost always go as the first example to a negative externality in production. In this situation, we have the provision of a good imposes a cost on society. So again, going back to interpreting the supply-demand model, in this case, you're going to have two supply curves, and the marginal social cost is going to now be greater than the marginal private cost. So you're going to have two supply curves, and the firm's supply curve for a negative externality in production is going to be to the right of society's supply curve, which would want much less of this product manufactured. A great example of this is pollution. Again, classic example that everyone always runs to for this topic. You can solve pollution through a number of ways. A very popular idea is that of a carbon tax that deals with the emission of greenhouse gases. You can also look at, for example, the United States creating the EPA as a way to address negative externalities in production through regulation or through fines if those entities do not comply with the regulation that has been approved and is now being enforced through whichever respective governmental agency. The last type of externality is that of a negative externality in consumption. In this example, or in this situation, my purchase or your purchase of a product causes there to be harm to someone else who is not purchasing the product at all. Graphically, we would look at this and we would say that the marginal social benefit is less than the private social benefit. So again, you're going to have two demand curves, except this time the individual demand curve is going to be to the right of the social demand curve, which would again want much, much less of this product being consumed by economic agents or consumers. Classic example of this would be things like secondhand smoke from cigarettes or cigars, noise pollution from college frat houses certainly falls into this example, as does traffic congestion. Me being on the road causes there to be, certainly not at a linear rate, causes there to be exponentially more or greater levels of traffic congestion. The way that we solve or attempt to solve a negative externality in consumption is through what are called excise taxes. They can also be called sin taxes. You will see these on things like cigarettes. It's overwhelmingly why cigarettes are so expensive, because we tax them, and we tax them extremely heavily, with the intention that, yes, we are to, again, harken back to an earlier module, we are going to reduce consumption, maybe not so much in the short run, but more so in the long run. But more importantly, the reason why we do it is we want to eliminate or mitigate as much as we can the negative externality in consumption that is secondhand smoke. We do the same thing with alcohol. We tax alcohol because we want to dramatically reduce the consequences that come with the negative externality of drunkenness. And then we also have in our major cities, San Francisco is the first one that comes to mind, though there are other major cities across the world. Paris also comes to mind, where if you want to bring a vehicle or park a vehicle within the city limits, you are going to have to pay an exorbitant cost for that. The rationale behind the ordinance that is crafted and then imposed by the city is that the congestion to which your vehicle is exponentially contributing has, very serious and well-documented negative externalities. It's not just you in the vehicle on the street driving to your location. There are a number of other economically related impacts that come from that one decision. Interestingly enough, as I was preparing for this lecture, the thought came to mind that, and I'm certainly not advocating for this policy, so please don't mistake it, but I want you to consider, and I'm going to leave you on this note, I want you to consider, is there an economic rationale? Could you use the jargon and the lingo in this module to understand the economics behind a book ban, where a local entity is saying, we believe that the consumption of this literature is extremely harmful and has profound negative impacts. again, I'm certainly not advocating for book bans here, but I do want you to understand that behind a book ban, rightly or wrongly, is this economic idea that by banning the consumption of the product, we can eliminate the knock-on effects or the spillover effects that might come from a child or a person reading this particular piece of literature. So those are the 4 types of externalities. Having gone through each of those and have been given you examples of those, and then walking you through the solutions and ways that we mitigate these spillover effects on third parties that, again, are not included, are not voluntarily consenting to the economic arrangement, which is now being thrust upon them in these situations. So I hope you found this interesting. Please always feel free to reach out to me if you ever have any questions or concerns. And I hope to speak to some of you soon. Thanks so much. Have a great day.